Forrest.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Owning your own home is still the great Australian dream. And at the moment, for many people, their great Australian dream is firstly to find a rental property and then a rental property that they can actually afford. In my electorate in the southwest of WA, realestate.com lists current vacancy rates in the Bunbury region at 0.45%. It's the nation's lowest vacancy rate for the seventh consecutive month. Since Labor came to government, rents in Australia, as we know, have increased by 26% on average. And Perth has been ranked Australia's second worst city for rental affordability. And Australia-wide, first home buyers and new home approvals remain at their lowest levels in more than a decade. At the same time, ASIC data shows that between July 2022 and April 2023, 1,709 construction companies across the country have gone into administration. But there was also a recent article, a news.com article, that put that figure at 2,349 construction companies across Australia that have collapsed in the last year alone under the Labor government's watch. So it's no wonder we've recently seen the weakest quarter of construction in more than a decade. There is no doubt that the Labor government's immigration policy of increasing overseas immigration to over 500,000 over the past 12 months, in the same time frame that new dwelling approvals are at only 162,000. Clearly, there's a discrepancy in these numbers. They don't add up. And that's what you're hearing from people on the ground. It's adding to both housing and rental pressures for those living here and those migrating to Australia. Now, Labor is going to add to this shortage by increasing migration by 1.6 million people over the next 5 years. So the dream to own your own home is a dream shared by those who were born in Australia as well as those who've come here to live. And for so many of our historic migrants who've chosen to come to this great country, Australia, they came because the opportunity was there to work hard, to save money, to buy and pay off and own their own home. Often that was their number one priority, the opportunity they saw in Australia, one they didn't have in the country that they originated from. Owning their own home actually set them up for life and gave them the security they were so desperate for. And I saw this firsthand living in Brunswick Junction and Harvey with our early, mostly Italian migrant families. Their absolute priority was to put a roof over their family's head, to pay it off and own that home so no one could take it away from them. And of course, some of these people had come from areas where they simply lived in a landlord's property and they didn't own any of it. This was a golden opportunity that they've taken advantage of. But they've also drummed this into each subsequent generation, their sons, their daughters, and said, you need to work, you need to save your money and you need to buy a house. And I've heard this myself more than once. But when I look at this bill, what I don't want to see is this great Australian dream of home ownership actually turn into a nightmare for the people who sign up to this Labor government scheme. There is no detail of what people will actually be signing up to. What we do know is that when you've finished paying off your house, if it's a new home you build, the government will actually own 40% of your home and will be entitled to 40% of what you sell it for, whatever the increased value of that home is at the time that it's sold. Now, if it's an existing home you buy, the government will own 30% of that home and will be entitled to 30% of the increased value or the value of that home when you sell it. So you won't own your home 100% outright, which is the Australian dream. But there's actually no detail about what happens if your home decreases in value over that time. And we've seen that, I've seen that in my own electorate and dealt with people who owed more than the house was worth. For anyone considering signing up to one of these deals, please do your homework. Get sound advice. What upfront costs over and above the actual house price will you still have to pay for and factor into your calculations before you say yes? There are several states already, as we know, running these types of government and private home ownership schemes. New South Wales runs a shared equity scheme that is so attractive to the market that 94% of the places are still available. So I'm concerned about who will take advantage of this one. WA runs the Key Start program, another shared equity scheme. In 2022-23, there were 90 loan approvals under the scheme, and as at June 30, 2023, 149 of these equity loans were actually in default, with 8 loans deemed mortgagee in possession in 2022-23. Now, neither of these figures is really surprising, given the 12 interest rate rises under the Labor government and what that's done to mortgage repayments for people. But under Labor's Help to Buy scheme, what will happen to those who are actually in default of that scheme and deemed to be mortgagee in possession like those in the Key Start scheme? Do you know what that will be if you're going to take this on? Who will the lenders actually be, and what arrangements will they have with the government and the homeowners themselves? And how will the homeowners repay the loan? Can the owner refinance if they need to? Now, none of it's explained in this bill. Will they actually lose their home? And given the state government owns 30% of each of these homes, and the federal government will as well, what happens next? What will happen to the people in these same circumstances under Labor's Help to Buy? At a state level, the state government owns 30% of that home. What happens when there is that decrease in value? At a federal level, it could be 30% on an existing home, or 40%. So what happens if those housing prices actually fall and you're behind on your mortgage payments? Will the government actually force you to sell your house for less than you paid for it? Well, there's nothing in this bill explaining this, or even who actually will be eligible. What's the criteria? What happens if your home is damaged or needs repairs? Who pays and when? And who bears the cost and the value of that? What happens if your income actually increases, you've earned some more money, and you're above the threshold, so you no longer qualify under the rules? What actually happens? So before people sign up, please find out. This is what you need to know. You're going to need to know all of this. And which agency is actually going to monitor and manage this side of things about your incomes? Who's going to be monitoring and managing that? Is it going to be the ATO or another entity? And if so, how will that work? Will you have to buy back the government's share of your property? And if so, on what terms and what timeframes? Will the price caps actually be adjusted over time? Should property prices continue to escalate, will those actual price caps be adjusted to match what you can and can't buy? And this will depend on a state-by-state basis. I just wonder how many of these $10,000 a year for 4 years will actually be available not only state by state, but for those of us like the member for Durack and myself, those that will be available in regional and remote parts of states like Western Australia. And do the price caps actually reflect the actual cost of buying or building a home in a major capital, perhaps like Sydney? There's some significant costs of trying to build a home in a place like Sydney. And I wonder whether people with a HECS help debt will actually qualify for a housing loan. And that will depend, I think, on the lender and their criteria, but nothing that's explained in this bill. So if participants buy in popular areas, will this scheme increase the price of housing in that area more broadly? And does that provide a barrier to even more people who are not in the scheme to be able to buy into that area? That's just a snapshot of the reasons I'm actually asking people to please do your homework before you sign up. What don't you know and you need to know before you take this step? Because the government will own either 30 or 40% of the home that you buy or build. Primarily, people need to get full details, absolutely full details, and you'll need to know what you will actually have to pay up front yourself outside of that actual home's costs. What are the other costs that are involved before you even get to building or buying the home? And there is no doubt that there is a severe shortage of housing. It's no different in my electorate of Forrest in the southwest of Western Australia. And a number of my local governments have been actively calling for our state government in WA to assist in being able to install the basic services, the basic utilities such as connecting electricity, sewerage, water, telecommunications and access roads. Some of them have got projects like that ready to go. Also need to speed up local and state government approvals processes. The red and green tape is a nightmare and just so costly, adding to the cost of actually building a home at all. And in WA, we saw the Aboriginal Cultural Heritage Act that would have added to this and worsened the process, as would the original proposed changes to the Water Act in WA that have since been taken off the table. And all of that has simply made local governments even more hesitant in this space, and that further increasing the costs for local governments, developers and even those just trying to build their own homes. In my patch, Albemarle, a lithium producer, only lithium hydroxide plant in Australia, is having to build its own village to accommodate its workforce because there are no other option. When you look at the caravan parks and anything that's available, often they're now populated by people needing permanent accommodation. And even when I get down to places like Dunsborough and the local Rotary Club, actually did a project providing lightweight swags for people who are living rough. They're living in the bush because they can't get affordable accommodation. And they were surprised at the age and who came out of the bush to actually take advantage of these lightweight swags. But we've also got significant problems in WA with delays in Western Power approvals and the cost. So the Help to Buy scheme will not meet the needs of Australians in the circumstances that I'm talking about. But again, I want to warn those who are considering taking up this option, please do your homework. Do your own due diligence so you are fully aware of all of the costs from the beginning to the end of this process. And this will depend on the criteria the government sets because it's not there now. Median house prices in Bunbury currently are $718,000. Will this qualify people under the Help to Buy scheme? In Busselton, that amount is $685,000. Will this qualify? In Capel, $469,000, according to realestate.com. And we've got a significant number of people right around Australia, but even in my part of the world, who are homeless. In the census of 2021, there were 809 homeless people in Bunbury, and I suspect that's a much greater number now. And I hear about it when I talk to my agencies that are working in this space and doing everything they can to help people. The combination of homelessness and high rents, which is forcing more people into this space, people they've never ever seen before, people seeking help with food, whether in whatever form, food and accommodation, that have never had to seek it before. But I'll end on where I started, Deputy Speaker. If anyone is considering this scheme, please make sure you get all of the information, know exactly what you're signing up for, and know that you are going into a shared equity scheme where the government will own either 30% of your property when it's time to sell or 40% of that property. Thank you, Deputy Speaker.